Right, back live with you tonight here on In Focus. Two more iterations coming from that road to the presidency. Where to next with Malungelo Boy and Ziyanda Ngcobo? We'll bringing that for the rest of the week. Let's turn to this now. The sixth Parliament's term ended yesterday with just a week to go until the 2024 general elections. Parliament's old chambers went up in flames in January 2022 as officials handed over the site to the demolition contractors to begin to rebuild the project. The Secretary to Parliament, Xolile George, joins me now for more conversations on their highlights, lowlights, opportunities for improvement, but looking ahead to the 7th Parliament as well. Good to have you, and thank you very much for coming in.
Good evening, Tevo. Good evening to Newzroom Afrika viewers.
So let's start with, I suppose, some of the highlights that would be important for us to look at. The big issues that you would have dealt with in the 6th Parliament, which are being commended, is the changing of rules, the changing of House rules, the changing of the Code of Conduct. How have these amendments, one, helped with the response times of Parliament, two, helping to have a Parliament move to a more open, more transparent, more responsive legislative body, but also on the Code of Conduct, how has this really helped just the general decorum of the place?
Well, thank you very much, Tabo. The specific issue around rule amendments is not a new issue in Parliament. Parliament now, in its democratic form, is finishing 30 years. So at every phase, at any given time, each House examines a set of rules that it operates under, and based on practice operations, as you know, the dynamic contact between decision-making and what transpires in the House may necessitate changes in the rules. And after some implementation, there will also be instances, Tabo, where it has not been anticipated. It has not been thought of that there could be this kind of a situation. Yeah. Then a House will make changes to the extent that rules must be amended to reflect both houses to create equilibrium on how to approach an uniformity. Then those rules. So in the 6th Parliament, likewise, rules have constantly been adapted and reviewed to make sure that there's greater cohesion in the House, there's greater anticipation of issues, but also tightening where people would have stretched the rule. As you would know, in any practice, there may be a rule that was never thought of, that if you did not say and or, somebody will jump into it. So those things have materialized on the ground, whether it's a chamber sitting or in a committee, and constantly the joint rules committees would look at issues of joint, or each House committee would look at that issue, plus issues of maintaining decorum. Tabo, you would have instances where there would have been a collapse of decorum, and rules would have to be adapted. So the 6th Parliament did likewise tighten rules around behavior in the House, conduct of members, but also make sure that when executive come to the House, and people may say, no, we have responded to the House, to the particular issue, and members will say, no, we have not adequately responded to it, and the rule may not have been adequately clarifying that matter. Then the matter will be tightened up in the rule, plus also issue of Code of Conduct, as you would say. The 6th Parliament has elaborately implemented a number of recommendations to tighten the issue of member discipline, but also when there's been transgression of rules of the House, then those rules are enforced through appropriate remedies that have been adopted by each of the House or a joint House sitting. And we have seen a fair share of implementation to bring back order and stability in the House. And as we close the term, Parliament as an institution has adequately implemented measures, which also from time to time would also look at it as 7th Parliament and say, are there any circumstances that may warrant a review? Yeah. And of course, that Parliament will be at liberty to consider such changes.
You are the first Parliament to impeach 2 judges, also the first Parliament to impeach a Chapter 9 head. Depending on who you're talking to, and you tell me how you take the criticism, you could put that as a legitimate process of accountability. Others are saying it's a regression in the transformation agenda, because you would have impeached 2 black judges or a public protector who is a black female.
Well, as you say, in the realm of public narratives, as well as discourse in general, people hold different views, and Parliament is not a harmonious setup either. It's a party with a composition of 14 political parties. It may be more in the 7th Parliament, and it would have been less in the previous Parliament. So the dynamic context on the ground would always necessitate that one issue that doesn't change is consistency in Parliament's execution of each instrument to hold executive accountable. Its instruments to implement measures to extract accountability and consequence management. And those rules are not rules that have been put up by Parliament. Section 174, 194 process is elaborately outlined in the Constitution. The Section 89 report and the Section 89 process is outlined in the Constitution. So does for judges. So when Parliament exercising that scrutiny, it would have set up due processes, special committees to look at it, and when those reports shall have been tabled in the respective house, in this case NA, NA deliberates on the matter. Democratically, all parties look at it. All we do as administration of Parliament is to make sure that a rule-based infrastructure governs those processes. There's strict adherence, because any process, as you would know, in public policy is vulnerable to contest, yes, either through the courts and so on. And many of the court judgments that have been directed, so-and-so versus Speaker of Parliament, so-and-so versus Chairperson, whether it's a bill or whatever, Tibos, it has always assisted parliaments to enhance its rule infrastructure, to make sure that it tightens. So the fact that 6th Parliament has been able to exercise that process of impeaching judges, impeaching Chapter 9 institution, is not an end in itself. It will
but how do you satisfy yourself, though, as Parliament, that that process is legitimate where you are sitting and not shrouded in the politics and politicking that is happening at the time?
It's not easy to escape that, as I said. In the process of execution of any policy, whether it's done at the level of executive or legislature or even courts for that matter, they are not immune to public scrutiny and criticism, because people hold different views. What Parliament knows, it has got rules, it has got the Constitution that is an embodiment of all aspirations of people of South Africa. So Parliament, as a trustee of the democratic order that we have in our country, has a duty to ensure that it not only meets the execution of that, but it does that in the intended letter and spirit that our constitutional values define what the role of a national legislature is. And Parliament is proud to have implemented all those measures and not shrouded by politics of the matter that this is black judges or female judges or female. No, there's rules. So even if it were to be a matter of saying there is a person whose term is ending in 2 months or whatever it is, Parliament must be seen to have...
A decision was reached on my part where I didn't even have legal representation. They'll come here and tell us that, you know, my legal representation was not well, was in hospital. You know, Parliament just went ahead and thundered ahead without giving me a chance to have representation. How do you find legitimacy in that kind of situation?
There's always a guided process, a meticulously guided process in Parliament. In any of the committees, you would have seen live proceedings in many of those committees, guided by fairness, and members of Parliament carefully scrutinize, they exercise their duties with utmost responsibility. And you would have seen many instances where they have taken such decision. Very few have been vulnerable to review, showing the level of probity in which they execute those matters. So it's important that as we look at the term, also this Parliament will bequeath to the next Parliament a set of rules that have been fairly robust and are durable. Yeah. They themselves may not be adequate, but it's always important to take into account that any institution evolves. The first Parliament evolved, reviewed issues of oversight, produced assessment report. We had a first report in 1999 called CODEA report that was looking at drivers of oversight, weaknesses that have been identified, and how to strengthen oversight, and produce a report in 2001 called Oversight, Enhanced Oversight Model. So does the third Parliament, looks at the rules, tightens certain aspects in line with the changing context of governance to understand the priorities set for a particular term of office, both in the coherence of government overall, but make sure that the legislative arm of government at the level of the state you now have a clear responsibility that Parliament is a bastion of democracy, is a torchbearer of accountability, and must be seen to be operating transparently to make sure that you build confidence and public trust in our institution, that if it's allowed to be eroded, then you start affecting the fulcrum of our democratic order. And Parliament is one that holds that, because it gives birth to the executive. It also gives birth to many cases when it comes to accountability of the judicial arm of the state. So the dynamic interface between the three arms of the state enhances the collaborative intent, which is very central to nourishing the discourse of democracy.
We continue in a moment, and when we continue next with the Secretary to Parliament, the lowlights and the opportunities for improvement as well. If you've got any questions for the Secretary to Parliament, send them through on 072 110 5584. Drop us an X at Newzroom 405. We're back in a moment. Back live with you tonight here on In Focus. Secretary to Parliament Xolile George, my guest tonight, as he wraps up the 6th Parliament and we look ahead to work that still needs to be done. Any relationship between what the 1st Parliament would have achieved in terms of bills and what the 6th Parliament would have achieved, so 531 and 145, to, I suppose, the ripple effects of the fire that would have stalled a lot of the operations to Parliament? That could be one reason. But the other one, a relationship between the number of bills that are coming from the executive versus number of bills that should be coming from the committees themselves.
Well, it has always been an interesting area. You mentioned 500 and something bill. Parliament passed 554 bills in 1994 up to 1999. And that is heavy traffic for any lawmaking process. But it was consistent with the establishment phase of a democratic system of governance in our country. You now have a constitution passed on the 10th of May, signed into law, and certified by the Constitutional Court. And that stands against a raft of legislation that was there, very central to the very establishment of an order that was not the most desirable for governing society. So dismantling, repealing was a centerpiece for that term of Parliament. Likewise, the 2nd Parliament So we now have about 1,507 laws, with 145 for this term, as you mentioned. Of course, as laws are made, the majority of them, they are about enabling the executive instruments of governance by the executive to implement budgets that have been appropriated by Parliament, but also to drive mandates of any government at a given time. So you are largely likely to have many of those bills coming from the executive in order to make sure that areas of execution that they have must receive the necessary traction around enabling laws to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So it is not a unique issue. Anywhere there will be bills coming from that. But also, as you said, committees are also allowed to initiate bills to bring forward legislation that must assist. Parliament itself needs legislation to make sure that it governs. It has done that in 2004, passing the Powers and Privileges Act of Parliament, and also the Financial Management of Parliament legislation, plus the money amendment bills to be able to amend a budget, the money bills issue.
Why do you say the FF's view that, I mean, that is the tail wagging the dog kind of situation, where mostly the bill-making process is governed by the executive, which in itself has got its own challenges. For example, the executive brings these things late introduction of bills, this impacting on the program itself, the proper scrutiny of these proposals, the constitutional court deadlines, and so on and so on and so forth, as opposed to these processes starting from the committees themselves.
It's not a matter of bills are done by the executive. They are not, but they are initiated at the level. So if there have to be amendment in the population register, which department will be responsible for that? It will be Home Affairs or Electoral Amendment Act. They would have gone through as a responsible department entrusted with governing that area as assigned by the President of the Republic. Then they would need necessary instruments. So at the initiation stage, they may be conceptualizing a bill, meaning the development of a explanatory memorandum around a bill. In other instances, it would have been a product of policy making, which is done by the executive in any way. So there will be what is called a brown paper, the policy development for what type of education must we have in a post-apartheid system. There will be a brown paper. After that, there will be a green paper. And it's a consultative policy-making process because of the democratic ethos contained in our constitution. After that, it will be a white paper. Arising out of a white paper, you will then have remedies in terms of different pathways. What rules do we need? Is it of a legislative nature? And once it comes, then it becomes initiation of a bill. So there's nothing untoward in that orientation of lawmaking, that largely it would be fuel by the enablement of the executive to drive its policy agenda. As long as those laws pass the scrutiny in terms of constitution and what aspects of the constitutional values that it needs to underpin, building social cohesion, addressing issues of minorities, but also dealing with the vital questions of inequality and untransformed society that we are coming from as an era. So largely you will have those instruments. As we sit now, 1,507 laws. It may well be in the 7th Parliament, there will be more laws. Or there may be rationalization of existing laws to create a much more compacting approach in driving much more streamlined form of governance, but at the same time, remove instances where you might have this piece of legislation under Environmental Affairs Department, but you must then go and check that one. And yet you want to implement a number of interventions now. So streamlining legislation to make sure that it becomes impactful is very important. At the level of Parliament in 2015, Chabo, there was a report that was called the High-Level Review Report, looking at legislation, the socio-economic impact of the intended legislation, and whether those laws that have been passed have been geared towards driving the socio-economic transformation that is very central to building a united and cohesive society that we're all aspiring to be. So that report, high-level report, it was led by former President Motlanthe, as it is commonly called, the Motlanthe High-Level Panel Report.
Yes.
It examined the lawmaking process, and it also came to a determination that every bill that comes before Parliament, there must be what is called impact assessment. And Parliament is looking at that. Every time executive brings a bill, it looks at that. What impact, what costing must be done on this bill, so at least there's clear parameters. The next issue that Parliament is looking at is the capacity of the department. Because it's one thing to enable legislation. On the one hand, there's no capacity to implement this. So the balancing approach of Parliament to be able to say as a lawmaker, arm of the state, what are the considerations other than the impact of what is desired, but also the capability and capacity of a democratic state to be able to drive those issues will be very central in examining every type of bill that come before Parliament. So I would imagine the 7th Parliament will be seized with those matters, taking into account the legacy reports coming from the 6th Parliament to make sure that critical questions are asked. Do we need more laws? Or do we need streamlined implementation of these laws? Is it about more legal instruments or is it about effective execution of this? So when exercise of oversight is done at committee level, it's done at House level, your plenary, members scrutinize all of those issues with the intention to say, how do we evaluate capacity of the executive to implement those? Are we empowering them adequately or are we impeding them? If there is sufficient empowerment, what is the base of Parliament to say so? So the reporting that comes back through committees and scrutiny enables Parliament to assess its oversight, assess its lawmaking process, but also answering the question, is Parliament itself adequately capacitated to make sure that you don't pass bills and by the time they reach the executive, the president is uncomfortable to sign the bill, maybe pointing to areas of constitutionality. So you need Parliament to look through those issues to make sure that any bill that is now being passed by houses passes the test of constitutional muster, but at the same time carries requisite instruments to enable faster implementation.
You've not escaped the scrutiny of our courts, especially, I mean, a couple of bills come to mind, but the Mogale judgment is one of them, and the Iron and Steel Institute judgment on public participation. But here, for example, on the show, we've spoken about the Bella Bill, public participation comes up tops. NHI, the public participation inadequate, comes up top. The climate change bill, public participation comes up. It seems the bar has been set quite high in this area of demonstrating meaningful public participation. How are you planning to improve that?
Well, public participation is an indispensable component of any democracy. It's a vital cog in terms of truly balancing two components of democracy. The representative form of democracy, meaning people elected representing their political parties in terms of constituencies, but the participatory form of democracy. So that the voices of the people are echoed not only in the chambers, of Parliament or committees, but the voices of the people must shape the character and form of laws that we make. So Parliament's duty in lawmaking is to make sure that as it does that, it consults widely. Now we are a country of 62 million people. So we may have been at 40-something at the time, 51 million, now 62 million. So put one bill. How many provinces we have? 9. One province would have on average 6 regions. Eastern Cape, Limpopo, Northwest 5 regions, Western Cape 6 regions, and you go to the vastest region like KZN with 11 districts. So if you have to take one piece of legislation, you must pass 2 tests, which our courts have pointed out very clearly to us as Parliament, to say you are weak on this aspect. You need to make sure that participation is not only participation, it must pass these 2 tests, meaningful participation and adequate form of participation. So any of these, if you're tankering on any of those 2, then the courts are going to find against yourselves. And we've been found wanting in certain areas in the form of adequacy. For instance, the traditional model, Thabo, of town hall meetings. People must be transported because of the spatial nature of our areas. You must take people in buses from one area, and probably it happening during midweek, other people are looking for job opportunities. It's not that they don't want to form part of that. The second part is the educational dimension of public participation. It's one thing to bring people into a hall. It's another to prepare them adequately and meaningfully. Meaningfully is not about 3 hours that you would have taken the people, but you inform me appropriately for the next probably 3 months to say, there is this bill that we are bringing. And as we bring this bill, these are the issues that are coming under this bill. And these are the issues that are going to be contained, they are aimed at this. So by the time people come next week, they can hear that it is now in OR Tambo district, in the Eastern Cape, you are coming to Alfred Nzo district. We have already followed up those public hearings. How do we create that right balance? But also look at areas, Tibos, where the resource implementation aspect is undermined by structural factors of inequality. You've got instances where there will be interest groups that will bus people or fly people. They follow every aspect of public participation to make sure that their voices are consistent. And then you ask, how do you weigh that? That in every area, one group is always there, yet other people are not there. So we need to improve ourselves as Parliament to make sure that town hall submissions is one of those areas where people stand up and ask, and Parliament has been doing that very well. But you must complement with the changing dynamic of our demographic. Young people are emerging. They've got strong views, correctly so, because this is their democracy. So the question we need to ask, are our instruments geared up to canvass a cross-section of society, to make inputs in such a way that the test of meaningful and adequacy passes the threshold that the Constitution set for us? Yeah. And we have now reviewed the public participation process that Parliament has done, and it's about resourcing that, but also resource Parliament adequately as an institution. Because in the absence of budgets for Parliament, it's one thing to say, stretch Parliament to do this. But if you don't arm an institution that must drive 154 laws in a particular term, what does it take to drive one law, one bill, to go through all of those? It's a lot, because you must translate into applicable languages. If you go to Limpopo, there's 3 dominant languages, Xitsonga, Sepedi, and Chivenda. So you need to make sure that the bills that you also produce, they are in those languages that are prevalent in a particular area, so that you don't bring an English bill and then after that. So it takes resources to be able to produce that, and the time lead factor. Right. So we have gone through the experiences where courts have raised the matter and we have been challenged, and our reviewed public participation seeks to address those issues. But the question of funding would also require that Parliament be resourced adequately to make sure that it doesn't pass bills that compromise. I was going to come to that, but now that you're there, let's talk about it. What needs to change in that budgeting model? That, I mean, it's not only yourself, it's the other arm of government as well. The judiciary says, when it comes to budgeting, we are treated like we are some government department, but we are not. We're an arm of state, and the budget needs to reflect that. Well, it's something that Parliament, as legislative authority of the state in the 3 arms, has reflected. Our Parliament has reflected on that, and I think the 7th Parliament will receive reports that reflects that, where Parliament consistently has said we are grossly underfunded. But what it has also discovered as Parliament since I arrived, at least for myself, is to ask critical questions. What is the funding model for Parliament? So we're now finishing 30 years. Do we have a funding model? And if we're to say we are underfunded to perform oversight, what is the attributes of adequate funding for Parliament for performing oversight? So what does it take to perform oversight, and what aspects of oversight you must do? So until you answer, almost like akin to doing zero-based budgeting. So we're currently developing a funding model to be able to take into account experiences where Parliament has performed oversight, whether it felt it performed adequately, or courts would have pronounced, or even civil society for that, but it doesn't have to be courts, and be able to say, if we were to perform oversight, this is what will be the full meaning of oversight in bounded houses, in committees, at plenary, outside through public participation. This is what it would mean. Public participation itself, lawmaking, what does it cost for Parliament to run hearings for one bill? You can only answer that once you develop a competent funding model, so that by the time you engage with the executive as the arm of the state, your own basis is clear, it's elaborate, but also looking at the instruments that must tighten the space for conversation. Yes. So that when the budgeting is done at the level of the executive, what are the touch points of conversations? Because the executive is guided by the Public Finance Management Act and the medium-term policy strategic framework. And then it goes through MinCombud, Ministerial Committee on the Budget with the Minister of Finance, and then they prepare to Cabinet. So what are the points of interface? When Parliament prepares its budget, where is the contact point? And it will be the same for the judiciary. So at least there is a very well-defined approach of conversation to make sure that what gets allocated to other arms of the state is reflective of the magnitude of the task that is assigned to them, is reflective of the mandates, but it also does not end up unintentionally disempowers them to carry out a constitutionally informed mandate process. So it's a dynamic conversation that we think that from our side as Parliament, working out on an adequate funding model, which we're busy with, we intend completing that by September, so that by the time the medium-term policy budget statement in October comes, Parliament has a basis of conversation and it sets the blueprint for parameters to go in the subsequent years going forward.
Let's talk now about some of the internal developments that have happened. Of course, one of the areas that would be a question to many is, what is the lesson that you would have learned from the... firstly, there was, of course, your predecessor that was caught up in some misconduct that needed to be dealt with. There is also the resignation of the National Assembly Speaker. How are you looking at these particular issues in terms of lessons that you're learning out of them?
Well, Parliament is an institution of accountability. It responds to certain matters like any other institutions. It will go through challenges at a particular time, but it remains consistent in implementing its rules. It remains consistent implementing accountability where it matters most. And it has got robust instruments to do that adequately. And it does exercise, whether it's powers and privileges, whether it is a joint standing committee or specialized committees that can be set up to look at particular, not only on issue of conduct, but generally where members, are required to disclose their interest in terms of declaration. There's infrastructure to manage that. When there's transgressions, ethics committee would sit as a joint committee, determine appropriate sanctions infrastructure, and it meets out. And it has done that in the 6th Parliament very successfully and probably more robustly, to make sure that Parliament itself set the right records for members of the executive, and where it must hold them accountable, it does. And where it also must hold its ordinary members, it also does. So it does the same in the administration, because you have a joint standing committee that looks into matters, and whenever there's transgression, executive authority of Parliament would take leadership on those matters and act decisively.
So, I mean, for example, on a position like that of National Speaker of Assembly, let me take this WhatsApp and then we'll connect it to this conversation as well. 072-110-554 from Dwai saying, kindly ask Mr. George whether Parliament will pay the legal fees or legal costs of the resigned Speaker of Parliament who is alleged to have accepted bribes while being Defence Minister. So, I mean, you'll answer that, but also something like that. Is there a much more stringent vetting process that should be followed in as far as who gets into a position of Secretary to Parliament, who gets into a position of National Assembly Speaker, where these things can be picked up earlier?
Well, on the side of the administration, Parliament has got robust infrastructure whenever it recruits officials, especially at the most senior level, like the head of the institution, the Secretary of Parliament. So part of those is to also perform those security checks, including scrutiny, probity on many areas. By the time it makes those decisions, it has already canvassed all those matters. On the side of the executive, as you know, people are either moved from one area, or they may have come through a party list system, like we would have now. You would have a list that would be sworn in. It's a product of democratic outcomes of elections. And by the time members there, they are given an opportunity to declare their interest, what assets, and any other form of business or undertaking. And what Parliament is looking at, the degree to which those matters are recorded and the degree to which they may be central to vulnerability to push particular interest, like any other institution that it is required to do that, to safeguard. So there's adequate safeguards around those matters to detect. And when it is discovered, then there's a rules on what must be investigated to look at consistency of that conduct with the rules set up for members. Are
you coming in on the Speaker's case?
We have not been made aware of any request that have been made, so I'm not aware. I can hear the questions, but Parliament is not sitting with any application that would have come from the former Speaker.
Staying with the internal issues, let's talk about, I mean, I spoke to Nahau the other day. They are saying hands off George. I don't know why. Did you hear that somebody was trying to get rid of you?
No. I'm not aware of that.
So they came in and they said, no, there's a plan to, they would have wanted to suspend you before the end of the sixth parliament. And they're saying, no, heads of Xolile George, he's been very good to us and he's listened to all our grievances and has responded to them. But they come in strongly to in your defense in this matter of the 70% increase of your salary. Just explain to us, because I believe the seventh parliament is something that they're going to have to deal with.
Well, I could see that your broader questions is going to land into that. I think out of respect, Thabo, for internal processes that I've adequately explained now, that Parliament has got fairly robust instruments and mechanisms to check any matter against public discourse. So it's easier to have media sensationalism, of course, 70% increase. It sounds very sensational. And once you start marrying that with facts, you might find that it may not be corroborated to the extent that it is mentioned. But respecting internal processes, when there's a due process set up for Parliament, I think Parliament must be allowed to look into those matters. And at an adequate time, it will pronounce, and people who make those decisions are not myself. It's the executive authority, and correctly so, it's able to account in appropriate structures. Yeah. So that we don't have a running narrative that may not be factually supported by many things.
Yeah. Internal developments, filling in of key posts, CFO post, chief of security post. This was 8 years late. There is a question also around, especially since we were talking public participation, head of committee of participation, as well as the new registrar of ethics, which is also, I think, 5 years in the making. That hasn't been happening. What's the challenge in filling those posts?
Parliament is a very complex institution, as you said. There's been instances of wide-ranging instability. I mean, the register of members' interest is not even 5 years. It's since 2013. So you can imagine 2013 up to 2024. That's about 11 years.
Sure.
If you count 2024. So the question, a position so vital as that, why would it remain vacant? So all I've done is to make sure that in my tenure, I would make sure that issues raised in the House must be executed. And one of those was the issue of, please proceed, fill this position that is very critical to hold the very basis of members to have credibility, for members to account and be able to ask others to account. There must be somebody who manages that administration of declarations and manages in such a manner that it is a person of repute to make sure that such sensitive area is managed adequately. So we're moving ahead to make sure that those areas are filled. Issues of sergeant at arms, crucial for the functioning stability of the House, maintenance of decorum and enforcement of rules or orders set by the presiding officer. But the issue of public participation, we have now moved to put stability in that area. And the Chief of Security, Parliament bent down. And the whole broken chain of security and the degree to which it was so juniorized as a level. And it's actually not consistent with the stature of Parliament as a national key point, where you need 24-hour vigilant management of an institution to prevent exactly what happened. So we have now elevated that role. We now have a chief of security, and we'll be able to balance all aspects of integrated security to make sure that Parliament functions adequately, but it also provides a safe and secure environment, given that it's an area where the executive comes, the judiciary comes, other institutions come to Parliament, international visitors come to Parliament. So it has to be an institution that it is not easy for anyone to penetrate without risking it being a securitized environment, but at least adequate presence of Parliament. So we're moving to fill those crucial positions to make sure that requisite capacities in all strategic areas of operations, we are not weakened, and we're moving to make sure that we capacitate the institution adequately.
So you made the announcement just before the close, of course, of the work that is now going ahead, budgets approved for the restoration of Parliament. What are the key things, maybe one or two, that you're looking forward to in terms of that work that needs to be done?
Well, it's an exciting phase for Parliament, understandably so. The restlessness of society. Parliament bent down 2nd January 2022. 2nd January 2023, its first anniversary. 2nd January 2024, second anniversary. Yeah. Where is the building? It takes time to prepare. It takes time to build a parliament, not for today, probably for the next 300 years, because we had buildings of a historical significance that were built in 1650-something, later on 1685, later on 1910. The last amendments were around 1980-something for the new chambers. Now, when you look at all of those infrastructure, you've got to first deal with the restoration of the ruined buildings to make sure that the national heritage legislation guides you on what aspects of heritage must be restored. I mean, we have instances, Thabo, as we discuss the conceptual outlook of the new parliament. Conversations, rightly so, will say, please make sure that the marble tiles that were there in 1641 are not
they're
affected.
kept, they're preserved, they're not affected.
Yes, and on the one hand, Parliament gender outlook has significantly transformed since 1984. So the fairer side of gender, people walk there with shoes. So when you've got those gaps in front of the government lane street, people are saying, hey, but your floors here are not supportive for environment.
Safety hazard.
But it was not designed for that at the time. So you've got to strike the right balance on the restoration. Yet the very parliament before it was bent down, it was wholly inadequate to even meet the basic compliance with the laws that have been passed, occupational health. So you have got small passages, you've got piping that would have been there 200 years ago, and you've got passages that could not support mass movement of people if there were to be fire and so on. So we've got to find a way of modernizing whilst also driving the heritage preservation aspect. So those two tensions have been very central for us, and yet we were given the building only from July 2023. Yes. And people would not be able to understand that access to the building to be able to start doing work could only happen in June 2022. And then we couldn't have the budget. Only on the 27th of October, that an appropriation of 2 billion rand was made to start the building. And we're proud now. We have a state-of-the-art parliament that reflects the embodiment of the spirit of the post-apartheid democratic order that we have, the imbuing of the values and the rich tapestry of cultures that define our people as a unified people. So that will be a symbol that reflects that. If you look at that new building that we have, you will see the secular structures we have. They reflect the beating of the drums that you would see in the logo of Parliament. The drums per se are not about drums, as you know. They are circle, but they are about voices of the people that must echo in the chambers of Parliament, in the domains of committees and outside, because a representative Parliament must also open up spaces of conversation to be influenced by people, because they represent the people. And that's what our preamble says. It says, we, the people, recognizes the imbalance of the pond and honoring those who sacrificed. And we are now committing to do the following. So they were taken then inside into the chamber. The chamber is a circle, a secular structure, and is reflective of the African traditions of architects that we have, rondavels that we have. And those reflect the commitment, the spirit of freedom, yet collaborative, because in a rondavel, everybody sits there. So you will see our chamber beautifully designed to reflect that, but also the lifting of the chamber. Our chamber would not be now in the floor. It's going to be lifted up, creating an open space for civil society and people to be present, to be able to visually see transparently in that committee what is being discussed, and be able people to see through. So the biophilic nature of the design allows people to see through, but at the same time also reflect the carrying. You will see them, they've got Y shape that carries up the chamber. So the lifting of it lifted by the people. Those 12 Y shapes are carrying that chamber, and there are 12 in total, representing the 12 official languages that we have. We have now just passed as Parliament a law recognizing sign language in addition to the 11. So you will see the 12 Y shapes carrying the chamber. At the same time, below is a transparent interaction for civil society. And you will also see people wear the first president of a democratic South Africa, Nelson Mandela, where he was sitting when he accepted the nomination as a president in the NA, that seat would have a light coming from outside that shows right down there, where people can sit and say, this is the seat that former President Nelson Mandela sat in accepting. And you will see the speeches of him. And they've got brailles in the whole floor, where the visually impaired people, they will be able to navigate right through, and it's a guided movement to make sure that all the laws that have been passed by our parliament truly reflecting unity and diversity, and also recognizing the multiplicity of cultures that we have, become a true embodiment of what is the meaning of a democratic parliament is. So it's quite an exciting issue that we want South Africans to say to us, when are you finishing this parliament? Will you take into account our views? When do we want to sit? You would have seen tables now that we have started demolishing last week. So by end of August, we would have finished demolishing the areas that have been declared unsafe to be repaired because of the strength of the fire. So the phase we're busy now is the demolition phase of the project. End of August, a main contractor shall have been appointed to start the process of site establishment and building. We envisage that by December 2025, at least the structure would have been up, and then you allow for 4 months for what is called dressing up, and the normal contract closing out period to where you deal with snags and all of those issues. So envisage that by 2026, come April, coming from August and from September, you will probably count about 20 something or 21 months to be able to finish the structure, working 24 hours, and hopefully we'll have a contractor that will be able to do that and make sure that come April 2026, the new Parliament of South Africa is there. Yes.
Secretary to Parliament, much appreciated, and thank you very much for spending time with us. A little bit longer, but I suppose you understand you were closing off the 6th Parliament. That is Xolile George there with us. Right, more news after the break. Stay with us.